actually training.
Support comes from the Arizona Inn, a four-diamond, family-owned historic resort hotel and restaurant on Elm Street near the U of A. Information is at arizonainn.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tucson Weekly Editor Jim Nintzel, and we're here to talk Zona politics. Joining me today is my friend Leo W. Banks, a longtime Arizona journalist whose work has appeared in Arizona Highways, the Wall Street Journal, and of course the Tucson Weekly, among many other publications. Leo is the author of the forthcoming Double Wide, a mystery novel about a former baseball player who gets mixed up with murder and drug dealers in the Arizona desert. Leo, welcome to Zona Politics.
Good to be with you, Jim.
So, Double Wide, classic murder mystery featuring an unlikely sleuth in the form of retired ball player Prospero Stark, who finds a severed hand right at the start of the book. Then, well, tell us what the book is about.
Prospero Stark is a former ball player. His career blew up in Mexico with a cocaine bust. It wasn't his fault.
Never is.
He didn't do it. He comes to Arizona to care for his father, who is actually on trial for murder. He buys a trailer park in the desert. One day he comes home and he finds a shoebox on the front steps. In the shoebox is a severed hand, and it's the severed hand of his former catcher.
And from there,
Rolando Molina.
The wheels start rolling.
Prospero decides, somebody cuts off my best friend's hand and stuffs it in the shoebox. I need to look into this.
And what was the inspiration for this village of Double Wide, which is the trailer park that he runs?
I wish I knew. You know, you sit down at the computer at 7:30 in the morning, and you need to put copy on the screen. All kinds of strange things come out.
It reminded me a little bit of why Arizona. I passed through on the way to Rocky Point.
I've passed through Y a few times. But Double Wide is actually set over the Tucson. Over the Tucson mountains up by Old Tucson.
So not as far away.
Museum. So it's
not as far away.
It's familiar territory. The Sonoran Desert is a great place to set a book. The opportunities for descriptions are terrific. It's a rich environment for characters.
We have a lot of characters.
We have a lot of characters.
And I recognized a lot of them as I read through this. The characters in the scenes, although I don't think you got Skinny Bob in there at any point. Our old friend Skinny Bob. The book itself seems to cover a lot of areas that you've written about. You know, it's the border, it's baseball. Fiction writing is different from reporting. How was it for you to make that transition from telling other people's stories to telling your own?
You know, a lot of it's the same. It's butt in chair, words on the screen, and then your first effort is lousy and you got to rewrite it. But with and also with journalism, it has to be true, right? But fiction, you can do whatever you want. It's a lot of freedom. That's probably the biggest difference. You can say and do whatever you want. But interestingly, the standard of believability is really difficult in fiction. Because if you say something that is, create a scene or a character that's really wild, people can say, I don't believe that. In journalism, you've got quotes, you've got court documents, you've got police reports. This really happened. So the standard of believability in fiction is different.
The truth can be stranger than fiction.
Much.
I hear echoes of a lot of noir work in here. And what were your inspirations as you're working on this?
Well, ever since I was a kid, I've been reading detective fiction. Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Jim Thompson, David Goodis, some of the pulp writers from the 40s and 50s and earlier, and I love those books. Detective fiction is literature. It's some of the best writing that we have. Raymond Chandler, I mean, he's one of the great American writers.
And I could hear echoes of those guys as I read this, because I've read those guys as well.
Yeah.
Any contemporary mystery novels that you enjoy?
That I like? Yeah, I like George Pelecanos. I don't know if you ever read him. He writes Sparrow Lucas novels, the Double and the Cut. He lives in D.C. I like him a lot. I like Michael Conley, the Harry Bosch novels. I like Dennis Lehane. A lot of people.
Is this the start of a series? Do you have more Prospero Stark stories in your head?
There is one underway as we speak. So this will be a series effort. And as I say, the Southern Arizona and the Sonora Desert is great ground for this kind of writing. I spent 20 years with Arizona Highways traveling around the state. Sometimes I think I spent half my life on dirt roads in Arizona. And I know the state real well, and the characters in Arizona are remarkable. You can't lose.
A lot of rugged individualists.
There's all kinds.
In this state. Hey, you're not doing a lot of reporting these days. Do you miss it?
No, not really. You know, every once in a while I'll get onto a story that I want to do, and I've done it for so long. You know, it's kind of nice to move on to something different. Every now and then I'll find something I want to do, and I'll work on it. But this is fun.
What did you enjoy about reporting?
I like meeting people and being able to tell a good story. You know, I got to meet a lot of interesting people who've done a lot of interesting things. And you know, it's good to get feedback. That's one of the things that you don't get so much with a book, because you spend so much time working on it that, you know, it's a year between books, something like that. But when we used to work at the Weekly, that was fun. When Dan was editor and you were writing, and you know, we'd go down and hang on, lay around on Dan's couch, and
glory days.
A lot of fun.
What did you know you wanted to be a writer?
I don't know. You know, I think I was born that way. It's an affliction, really. I wrote when I was 10 years old, I wrote a book about the Civil War, which I was interested in the Civil War as a kid. And my father, who was a math professor, I asked him to write an introduction to the book. He wrote a 4 or 5 paragraph introduction, and I bound it up and you know, made it look fancy, and I still have it. I just dug it out a month or so ago. I
think I got one of those lying around my house somewhere as well. You came from Boston originally. What brought you to Arizona?
Grad school, journalism.
And
stayed. I worked for the Star for 7 years.
What was it like working for the Arizona Daily Star in, what was that, late 70s, early 80s?
Yep, good, fun. My first job, I walked into the building and my first job was troubleshooter. You know what that is?
It was helping people. The readers would send you letters. The readers had a problem.
No, it was a consumer column, so that if some lady living somewhere on the south side sent away for an Elvis Presley Love Me Tender alarm clock to some company in Arkansas and it didn't come, she wrote to me, troubleshooter. And I called her up and said, "Don't worry, ma'am, troubleshooter's on the job." And then I'd call the company and then go back and forth and get the lady her alarm clock.
She'd get her clock. At the end of the day,
she had to get her clock. I delivered.
You made sure. She made sure she got her clock.
This was in those days, you know, in the late 70s. The Star had some pages, right? I mean, there was advertising in pages. So we had a consumer page, a big food page, all this kind of stuff. You don't have that anymore.
But are you still solving problems for people?
Well, Prospero Stark is. I just make them up.
How'd you find your publisher?
Well, on the internet. Brash Books is a small publishing company. I sent them an email on a Wednesday. They responded Wednesday night and said, email being 4 or 5 graphs describing what the book is and who I was. They don't want to waste their time reading stuff from somebody that, you know, isn't going to work. On Thursday, I got an email saying, "Sounds good, send it along." On Monday, I got a call saying, "We'll do it."
No kidding.
And it never happens that way. Publishing is notorious for glacier-like time frames. So that was good.
How long did you work on this?
You know, I think many people have asked me that question, and it's hard to answer because it was off and on for such a long period of time. Because my other job was writing, you know. so you know what it's like. I mean, you've got a certain amount of words in you every day that you can sort of produce and put on the screen, and after that, you're done. So I was working on it for a long period, whenever I got time.
All right.
I would say several years.
And it's coming out?
November 1st.
November 1st. You have a book signing coming up?
Clues Unlimited. I think it's November 18. It'll be at Singing Wind in Benson, November 19. And Poison Pen in Scottsdale on November 28th, which is a Tuesday.
All right.
Tuesday night, November 28th.
Well, Leo W. Banks, the book, is double wide. Folks, you want to check this out. It's terrific. Murder mystery. Leo, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And we will be right back with Joellen Russell from the University of Arizona.
Zona Politics is made possible with the generous support of the Loft Cinema, Tucson's independent movie theater. The Loft features independent foreign and documentary films, cult classics, discussions with filmmakers, and much more, including the Loft Film Fest in November. The Loft is located at 3233 East Speedway Boulevard. Showtimes can be found at loftcinema.org. Support for Zona Politics is provided by Hotel Congress in historic downtown Tucson. More information at hotelcongress.com and 622-8848. The Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce serves the business community in the bilingual, bicultural region of the Arizona-Sonora border and is a proud media partner with Zona Politics. Learn more at TucsonHispanicChamber.org.
All of these young people from the community come together, actually get up and do something.
We can do anything!
I think we've attracted a lot of people that are super passionate.
We're here at the No Ban, No Wall protest.
If you come out of college, you have this experience, you know how things run, you have a huge leg up.
People who have ideas and who are dreamers, you know what I mean, who really want to get themselves out there. I think that they should come here.
From time to time on our program, we like to introduce you to scientists. Last year, we introduced you to Joellen Russell from the University of Arizona, who's working on climate change projects and the ocean. Here's a repeat of that segment. Joining us in the studio is Joellen Russell, a U of A Associate Professor of Geosciences who specializes in studying the impacts of climate change on the world's oceans. Dr. Russell, welcome to Zona Politics.
Thanks for having me.
So what got you interested in studying the oceans?
I'm an odd duck. I grew up in an Eskimo fishing village 31 miles above the Arctic Circle on the Chukchi Sea, which is actually part of the Arctic Ocean. And being up there in a place where you're very isolated and nothing but big, broad horizons, I couldn't wait to be an explorer. And since I decided that all the land had been explored, there was nothing for it but to go to sea.
And these days, you're learning about the impacts of climate change on the oceans, and you've learned that the heat energy from the increased release of carbon in the atmosphere has really been sinking into the sea.
Absolutely.
What has been the impact of that?
Well, we've seen almost 93% of the energy imbalance that we measure at the top of the atmosphere. You know, we look out at the sun for how much is coming in. We look in at the Earth to see how much is actually making it back out to space. We see that the energy imbalance is growing every year. That energy imbalance has to go somewhere. And so what we've found by measuring it is that it's going into the ocean. 93% of the human-related greenhouse gas forced warming has gone into the ocean. And we see this in every ocean. We see it warming not just right at the surface, which you'd expect from the sun and the warmer atmosphere, but also it's mixing that heat all the way down to about 4 kilometers. And it's mixing it very specifically in the ocean around Antarctica.
And what does that do to the ocean?
Well, it does two things. One, it makes sea level higher because when you warm the water expands. And so in places like Massachusetts, you're seeing the surface current is warming and expanding the water, and then the deep current is warming and it's also expanding the water, giving you quite an abrupt pop-up in the sea level. But it also does other things. If in places where it's really warm near the surface, it tends to suppress actually the mixing because it takes more wind energy to mix away all that warm water that's deeper and deeper and deeper as it warms and warms and warms. And around Antarctica, we're actually seeing it warm all the way down to 4 kilometers, 4 kilometers. And that's actually doing a great thing for us here in Arizona, which is reducing the rate at which the atmosphere warms. It's still warming, but it's warming slightly less than it would normally because without all this ocean uptake of heat. And so I like to give a public interest talk that's called How the Antarctic is Helping Arizona Keep Its Cool.
And what's happening with the life, the sea life? Is this having an impact on the sea life?
So the warming tends to do two things. One, if it suppresses the mixing, and it does this in many oceans around the world where it's not as vigorously mixed as around Antarctica, and what it does is that thick, warm layer of water makes it harder for the wind to push away the warm water and pull up to the surface the water that's cold and full of nutrients, plant food. That water, they strip it all out from the surface layer, and they need the wind to pull new water to the surface to feed the base of the food web for the global ocean, which is the phytoplankton that harvests the energy from the sun and turn it into all that lovely green that eventually becomes our fish.
So, and I think it's having a bad impact on things like coral too, right?
Well, now that's the tricky part. Is it's not the heat that's causing this problem. The problem is that all the CO2, when we burn anything, wood, coal, fossil fuels of any variety, oil, gas, et cetera, when we burn them, the byproduct is CO2. That's the combustion product. And so we see from all of our measurements in the atmosphere that it's going up, 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 up. We're over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere now. We haven't seen this for millions of years. And all that CO2, unfortunately, it is soluble in water, CO2 soluble. So what happens is it dissolves in the water and it forms a carbonic acid, a weak acid. So essentially, the more CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the more we're essentially titrating or acidifying the ocean. So we've actually observed that the pH in the ocean is dropping. And this, you would think, is not a big problem, except many of our tiny sea creatures, and bigger ones too, make their homes, their shells, out of calcium carbonate, which is the same thing you have in Tums or antacids, is you want to eat one of these and then you burp, right? Well, that's actually how when you put acid in the ocean, carbonic acid from CO2, you're acidifying the surface layer and deeper as it gets into the ocean. And the ones that are at risk are things like the base of the food web, like our coccolithophores, which are one of the most prevalent phytoplankton on planet Earth. They are all made out of they make their shells out of calcium carbonate, which it can be dissolved like a tum. And then things like reefs, coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef. Now, right now, they're sitting in warmer water, so it makes it less of a threat at the moment. But given the rate at which we're pumping out CO2, if we don't reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're essentially going to see in 50 to 100 years, the Great Barrier Reef will dissolve.
Yeah, you gave a talk, you led off the lecture series, and one of the things you said was if you're going to see the Great Barrier Reef or take your children, you better do it sooner than later.
Now, because it's not just that they dissolve, it's ragged. It will have harder time growing. The diversity may decrease because only the most robust, most hardy will survive. These are the sorts of things where if you want to see the Earth the way she was, the ocean, the way she was meant to be seen, go now, go quickly, don't wait.
You know, the Joaquin Ruiz, the dean of the U of A College of Science, was on this program a few weeks ago, and he mentioned, you know, water is going to be the hammer of global warming, and it's definitely affecting our weather patterns. The westerly winds you mentioned in your talk,
big deal.
Moving towards the poles. What is the impact of that?
So it's done two things. So we have these two big bands of westerlies in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere, and they're contracting toward the poles. I hate to say this, but kind of like a noose, getting tighter towards the poles. And this is partly the effect of our ozone holes that we ripped open with chlorofluorocarbons, freons from our fridges, et cetera. But it's also partly due to the fact that the lower atmosphere is warming because of all that extra CO2. So both effects, the cooling and the warming, are forcing those winds towards the poles. So the direct effect is that we get drier in southern Arizona. We're on the edge of where the westerlies can reach us. We normally get 3 to 5 storms. In bad years, it's 2 or 3, maybe. And those storms, when they reach us, that's what we get all our surface water, what we get our snow from, et cetera. So if the westerlies tilt towards the poles, we expect to get fewer storms making it all the way to us in southern Arizona. And that's a problem for many, many reasons, crops, agriculture, and other things being just the least of it. But we also have issues with, in the ocean, what that does is it changes what's stirred. So the ocean near the equator and in right next to the US on both sides gets stirred less. So in fact, because we've got less wind energy, because the winds have moved away, basically, making these big, huge gyres of warm water, basically the warm water thickens, which may decrease the total productivity in these whole areas in right where our major fishing grounds are, on either side of the US. The same thing in the Southern Ocean is happening, except that it's all ocean down there until you get to the continent. So what there, it's actually given us a little boost. And what it's done is by tightening nearer to Antarctica, because it pushes the water away in all directions away from Antarctica, these very intense winds and the Coriolis force, the water upwells, and it's upwelling from deeper and deeper, cold, rich, full of nutrients. Now, the bad part is it doesn't seem to be stimulating much additional growth, although we're not certain. We're going to wait for our floats to see how it happens. But because it's so dark during so much of the year when all this is happening, so it may not be stimulating growth, but at a minimum, it's bringing all this cold water to the surface, which is allowing it to take up additional heat and additional CO2.
You mentioned your floats, and we've got about 2 minutes left, so I didn't want to leave without talking about these floats, which is an amazing project. BGC Argo floats out there in the ocean. Tell us about these
So
things.
exciting. So the National Science Foundation has funded me, and I'm leading the modeling component. Lynn Talley at Scripps Institution of Oceanography is leading the observational component, and it's directed by Jorge Sarmiento at Princeton University. And what we're doing is we have it's called the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observations and Modeling. And the National Science Foundation has given us $21 million to do a combined project where we are deploying these profiling floats, autonomous robot floats that are making the measurements more every 5 days. They drop down to 2,000 meters, come all the way to the surface, making measurements of carbon, nutrients, oxygen, et cetera. And then they beam that data back by Iridium satellite, and we get it up on the web within 2 hours. And so a ship might take a few profiles along its distance, and it costs $40,000 a day, bare boat for a ship. These floats cost about $100,000, and they work for 5 years doing profiles every 5 to 10 days. We think we can transform our understanding of the ocean sink for carbon by making these measurements.
And how many of them do you have out there?
Well, right now we've got 34, and we will have almost 200 out, and so it's very exciting. We've also just got an agreement with the 9 of the top 10 float deploying countries to actually build a global biogeochemical Argo array of these floats, so that with a global array, we can actually reduce the uncertainty in the amount of carbon going into the ocean, which will allow us to verify the carbon agreements that we've just come to in Paris at COP21 at the Conference of the Parties. So we have a carbon agreement. We've got new biogeochemical profiling floats. We're going to do carbon management. Here we go.
That's amazing. And they literally float around, they sink down, they rise up, they send the data to the satellite, and you get it.
And we put it online for the public, as well as using it for our carbon management and other things.
Extraordinary work, and I want to learn more about it, hopefully, once you get some more data coming in.
Oh, so excited.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Zona Politics. We always enjoy having authors on Zona Politics. Here's a look back at our interview with Stephen Buckman, the author of The Reason for Flowers. Today, we're back to talking about books. My first guest is Stephen Buckman, a U of A professor and author of nearly a dozen books. The most recent, The Reason for Flowers, is just out in paperback. Steve, welcome to Zona Politics.
Hi, Jim. It's great to be here.
You know, this book is The Reason for Flowers. It's really a celebration of flowers and the role they play in nature. Why do you find flowers so fascinating?
The bottom line, I think, is I like to think that if flowers didn't exist, if they hadn't come on the scene over 100 million years ago, that maybe humans wouldn't be here. So I think of our distant hominid relatives as seeing flowers as the harbinger of fruits and food that would soon come next. So they notice them. And I think this has a lot to do with our innate preference for flowers and the fact that since they do turn into fruits and seeds, they end up feeding the world.
And we use them for romantic gestures, but they have some very strange sex lives themselves, and you get right into that at the start of the book. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Flowers are like living billboards, right? Signposts. So they have some of the most saturated colors in nature, other than birds and insects, which have some pretty flashy colors. Flowers signal to their pollinators and us with colors, scents, with their shapes. They even have some hidden colors. The ultraviolet rays that give us a sunburn actually in some flowers create ultraviolet patterns, which the Germans called Softmal, sort of sap signs or marks. And these are hidden lines that unless we have a camera with a special filter, we can't see. But since bees and certain other pollinators like butterflies can see the ultraviolet, they know where to probe for hidden nectar and pollen. So they're doing that sort of thing. There are flowers that blush when they're pollinated. They'll turn from yellow to red, and once they're red, bees know, hey, nothing is left. No nectar is there. There are even flowers that look like the mates of bees or wasps. So they physically look like them, they smell like them, and they're actually pollinated by, let's face it, lusty males that think they're pollinating with a real insect, or mating with a real insect.
And these pollinators are pretty important in terms of taking keeping the flowers alive. They're moving from flower to flower and spreading the genetic material and genetic diversity.
Yeah, I like to say that pollinators don't get around much, right? They're literally rooted to the spot. So unless they're a wedding bouquet or a prom corsage, they're not getting out into the world that much. So flowers rely on these go-betweens, bees, butterflies, flies, but also, in this part of Arizona, hummingbirds and bats. So they move the sex cells, the pollen, from flower to flower.
And you've been really fascinated by bugs since a very early age. What got you hooked?
I've always been fascinated with bees, for example. I started keeping honeybees in high school, and I soon moved to the bees that really fascinate me, the ground nesting bees, social bees like bumblebees, and just how they make a living and how they interact with flowers around the world.
And what is going on with this colony collapse with the bees?
Yeah, in about 2006, 2007, some Pennsylvania beekeepers noticed that they would pop the lid on their hives and they would find the queen and a handful of bees. The honey was there, the brood was there, but it was as if the bees had absconded. The media jumped in, and there were claims of cell phones were killing bees. It was bee rapture. Don't think so. All kinds of things like that. But unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know. It's kind of a perfect storm for bees. There's an undercurrent of pesticides. You may have heard of the neonic insecticides, which are applied to crops as seed treatments. Those are killing bees. But there's also a lack of bee food out there, the sort of bee pastures where bees go to forage. And the fact that, at least for honeybees, over 1 million of our 2.5 million colonies of managed bees ride on the back of 18-wheelers to the gold rush that is the almond bloom in California. So every February, March, the bees go there. And they come together, they pick up diseases, they're exposed to pesticides, so not a good situation.
What's the consequence of losing these bees?
Fortunately, honeybees aren't the only bee on the block. In Arizona, we've got 1,300 native species of bees. In the United States, it's about 4,000. So every crop or wildflower is not just pollinated by one bee. It's not a one-to-one situation. So fortunately, Mother Nature has some redundancy or a backup. So if a flower loses one of its pollinators, like honeybees, there are some wild bees that can step in.
And if people discover they have Africanized bees in their yard, in their house, what should they do?
Yeah, it's a tough situation. I'm a conservationist. I don't like to kill bees. I mean, Africanized bees are important pollinators, but if they're near a front door or a porch or someplace where they're going to be jostled, the vibrations will set them off. And we've had something over 5 human fatalities from Africanized bees in Arizona, and hundreds of deaths of dogs and cats and horses. So sometimes the bees need to be removed because Africanized bees are unpredictable.
And you've traveled all around the world. What's the most exotic flower you've come across?
Probably my most exotic trip was to Borneo, and finally, instead of just reading about it, came across the contender for the world's largest flower. So it's about half the size of this table. Has a really strong smell, actually smells like carrion and is pollinated by flies. So this giant Rafflesia occurs in Malaysia, Indonesia, the states of the island of Borneo, and that was probably my most memorable exotic trip, to finally see the world's largest flower.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. The book is The Reason for Flowers. The author, Stephen Buckman. Thank you for coming by. That's our show for today. My thanks to our media partners at Tucson Weekly, Tucson Local Media, Creative Tucson, and Community Radio KXCI 91.3 FM, where you can hear a radio version of the show at 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoons. If you missed any part of today's show, you can find all our episodes at zonapolitics.com, and be sure to follow us on Facebook. I'm Jim Nintzel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Zona Politics is hosted by Tucson Weekly senior writer Jim Nintzel. The program is produced by Jennifer Powers Murphy and Danny Vinnick and edited by Jim Rundle. Special thanks to KXCI, Tucson Weekly, Brink Creative Digital, and all supporters who provide crucial funding for the program. Learn more about Zona Politics at zonapolitics.com, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter.